So as everyone is dialing in, I'm going to start sharing our slides. We're going to allow a couple of minutes for our audience to gather. And while we do so, I will begin to share our antitrust policy notice. Before every Linux Foundation event, we show this antitrust policy notice. It gives an opportunity for people to find our full antitrust policy on the website, and it gives an idea of how we manage our events in this organization. Basically, we're trying to make sure everyone has a great forum to talk, and it's equitable and fair to all parties. Now, people are dialing in from all over on this event, and we have a lot to cover today. We are going to have our M&A Summit. This follows other summits, for example, our IP Summit, our Security Summit, and it fits into a larger picture of how we're trying to help every organization addressing open source compliance, open source process management, how we're trying to make sure everyone has a great way to get started in this field and a great way to understand what's going on and why. With this event, you can expect a series of presentations. I'm going to show you the rough schedule we have ahead of us. We will be running for approximately 3 hours. Now, don't worry if it's too late on your side of the world. We will be trying to make sure that we have plenty of recordings for all parties to catch up if they don't get this live. Though we do hope you are here live, and we do hope that you feel free to ask questions. Remember, OpenChain is always about how you can be part of our community, how you can share in the communication, how you can be part of creating new information for everyone involved. This event is going to be the first event where we actually are leading ourselves through the partners. Because we're talking about M&A, we wanted to have something a little bit broader than simply talking company by company. And we wanted to, in that case, make people aware of the broader picture of what's going on. To do that, we asked our very large community of companies that are in the partner program to step forward and to share their stories. The idea here, of course, is that by hearing from these companies, hearing from their experience in supporting many, many companies around the world, we will learn more about M&A in our domain than we would otherwise. Now, at the moment, we're bringing everyone in, and we're going to be promoting our speakers to be panelists and to be ready to talk and share their stories and news. The event will open with Leon from GTC Law, and I want to give Leon some special thanks because he's also been instrumental in getting this event organized. He's going to talk about typical M&A involving specifically OpenChain. We're going to proceed then into the perspective of M&A and security, which obviously is critical at this time. We do have a lot of vital stuff happening on the security front, and Jan is going to lead that for us. We're going to then move to checking compliance with Foss Matrix, talking about practical ways to check compliance in M&A activities. And that is going to be led by Hendrik from Osborne Clark. Then we're moving on to sustainability and open source licensing, a topic which is perhaps under-addressed in the market. We do need to make sure that sustainability is front of mind. That's for compliance, that's for security, and that's for continuity. Andreas from Bitsy is taking care of that. Then finally, we move towards specific M&A case study time with Marcel from PwC. Very much looking forward to hearing about that, where we tie things together with a real-world case study. And finally, a panel with all of our presenters talking about what they've said and taking questions from you about what it means. Now, to get started, I'll hand over to Leon to do his presentation of a typical M&A with OpenChain. Leon, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Shane. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes, it's perfect.
Excellent, excellent. So Shane, thanks again for the opportunity, and I think this is going to be great and a lot of fun. And now let's lock the doors, make sure nobody can leave for the next 3 hours. Before we get started with the meat of the presentation here, and perhaps a little bit because I'm influenced by my kid and his friends, let's answer the "why should I even listen to you?" question. So we at GTC have a lot of experience with open source diligence and transactional settings. We specialize in complex M&A transactions. We represent buyers and sellers worldwide. We help companies assess their IP assets. We guide companies on their journey. Sometimes that's right from startup to their exit, and sometimes we then end up guiding the acquirers to their exit too. So they must like what we do. We have an entire open source compliance and due diligence group. It's not just some lawyers who moonlight as open source lawyers. We've been doing this for a very long time. I've been here for over 12 years, and I am not by far the longest tenured lawyer here. As some of the other folks in the group, I developed software for almost 10 years before I became a lawyer, and that gives us a little bit of an edge when it comes to understanding some of the concerns developers often have, and it helps to ease communication as well. We may not have all the right answers. That's something I tell my kid too. I don't think, to be honest with you, anyone can have all the right answers when it comes to open source compliance. There's way too much gray area, but we certainly see these issues a lot. And we know what tends to work and what doesn't. And so that's why we're here. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about open source. Let's talk about OpenChain. Let's talk about transactions. There's a lot to cover. I'll try to go very fast to fit within my 30 minutes. We will have some time at the end, as Shane said, for some discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. And obviously, if you have any questions going along the way, feel free to sort of ask, and we'll pause. So with that out of the way, let's start with transactions. And really, we start before the transaction, before the letter of intent. With transactions, timing is everything, right? And so preparation matters for both sides. It's going to help things go smoothly during the transaction. And honestly, if you're the seller, it's going to help you run your business better anyway. During a transaction, the goal is going to be to identify, analyze, and mitigate risks associated with the use of third-party software. You'll hear me use that term a lot, third-party software. I don't say open source software because when it comes to the review that we do, there's really no difference between commercially licensed software and open source software. The risks can be a little bit different, but in the end, it's all a compliance exercise. You're checking the use of software against licenses. Poor practices, either by the buyer or the seller, can lead to financial issues, right? You can get sued. It's unlikely, but it does happen. More likely, though, what will happen is that as the seller, you'll just make less at your exit, right? The valuation won't be as high as it could be. There could be business issues. Injunctions, again, extremely rare. What's more likely is that somebody in the legal department is going to say, hey, we can't ship the product until you fix this. Right, that's a business issue. And of course, deal issues, unfavorable terms, risks in your deals, right? And more to that point, right, the buyer needs to know what to look for to try to find problems. Otherwise, you just won't know what's there. And the seller needs to know what's in their code. And that's really rare without having completed the review that I'll talk about in a second. And you need to do that. You need to know that as the seller, because you need to be able to make your reps, and you need to be able to make the required disclosures during a deal. So before the transaction, as the seller, really, this is where you can do the most to help yourself, right? Later on, it's generally a little too late. You're running around from dumpster fire to dumpster fire, just trying to quickly answer questions. So here, the important thing to remember is you're going to have to do this at some point, right? So your developers don't like answering legal questions. They don't like answering compliance questions. They like developing software. I get it. But at the same time, this is work that's going to happen. And if you do it on your own time, as opposed to on deal time, it's actually less disruptive to the overall enterprise. It's cheaper, it's better, and it could save you from having to remediate things in a costly way later. Now, one of the things that you can do and you should do is you can put in place a written third-party software policy. This matches section 311 of the OpenChain specification. You'll see there are lots of section numbers on our slides here, and it's because the alignment between the spec and what we're talking about is just absolutely perfect. So as the specification calls for, it's a good idea to train your company on the existence of the policy, right? Just having a policy and having nobody know that it's there doesn't really help anyone. One thing the specification does not cover is what makes a good policy, and that's by design, right? There are many ways to skin this particular cat, but here's what we think works. A good policy balances the risks of open source against the benefits to your developers. Best policies are created with everyone in the room. Developers get to weigh in, they get to participate in the process, they get to tell you what does and doesn't work for them. That way, it's not just an edict from a legal mountaintop that they can't or won't follow. It's usually best to do this after you've done your initial round of review. So you know what components are in your code, what licenses are impacted, what the usage is. You sort of know where you're going to come out. If that's not possible, if you don't have the time to do that, start with a generic policy. Start with something that you think is going to work, and then adjust as you go along. And that's one thing to remember, that policies aren't set in stone. They're meant to be a living document, so you can adjust them over time. Be sure to cover both using and releasing open source, right? So contributing to open source projects, that's something that people sometimes forget, and it's incredibly important, as is contributing to open source projects in general. Be able to show compliance. Records of requests and approvals are helpful and also required by section 315 of the spec. And then try to avoid having exceptions to your stated policy, right? If your policy says, I won't use commingled GPL code that I've modified and distribute to my customers, then don't do that, right? Don't put yourself in a situation where you have to explain why your policy doesn't match reality. The other thing that you should do is review your code, right? And you do that in the way that will be reviewed during the transaction. And that means both self-disclosure, so using your package managers, get the known third-party components out of those, and with the aid of a code scan to back that up, make sure that everything's covered. Document the review, as I said earlier, that's section 315. And one thing to remember is it's absolutely impossible to perform this review without involving developers and collecting at least some usage information for some of the components, right? And that's in section 332 of the spec. How do you get started? That's a lot easier said than done. You need buy-in from the developers, and that's sometimes hard to do. They like to develop software. They don't like to do compliance work. So my piece of advice is find that one influential, opinionated, really smart person in your group of developers that's going to have an opinion about this. Get that person on board, and then everybody else will follow. And if you can't think of that person right now in your head, then congrats, you're probably that person. And the fact that you're here is good news, right? The outcome of diligence is going to be the software bill of materials. That's in section 331 of the spec. The spec calls for names of components and applicable licenses. We like to also include the usage information we collected during diligence. And the reason for that, even though it goes arguably beyond the spec, which again is purposely vague because we need that kind of flexibility. But the reason we like to include usage is because it gives context. So in during a transaction, right, just saying, hey, this is my list of components, here's everything that I have is good. What's better is, here's my list of components, and for any of these items where you may have questions, here's the reason why they're okay, right? It helps you sort of come out of the gray area a little bit. We like to also include explanations, right? And I'll talk about that in a little bit for some of the harder to understand items. And then notice and attribution files as needed. They're not always needed, but when they are, they're important. And the reason for that is because lack of attribution leads to auto termination in some cases for some open source licenses, and auto termination leads to infringement, and infringement is bad news. I don't think I'm breaking any news here. So that makes notice and attribution files a compliance artifact under section 341 of the spec. And another thing too is it's incredibly easy for somebody to prove non-compliance when you don't have a notices file, right? They don't have to have a court tell you what is or isn't a derivative work. It's sort of binary. You either have it or you don't have it. The good news is if you've completed your diligence, you've created your bill of materials, it's really not that hard to go from there to a notice and attribution file. What you need is someone, and there's lots of us that can do it now, that will go out there and collect the license text for you so you don't have to do it manually, and then get those all into a notice file that's easily updated, right? And there's, well, like I said, there's plenty of people nowadays to help. And then finally, you want to address any known issues through remediation or explanations, right? My typical approach, and maybe this is because I did used to develop software, is you don't want to make the developers take anything out of their code, right? Our goal is to sort of make everything work. Sometimes that's not possible. General rule of thumb on a transaction is if you don't think that you can get a bunch of lawyers, now notice I said lawyers, not developers, in the room from the buyer side, comfortable in a few words such as this is internal use only, or this is mere aggregation, then maybe you want to take it out, right? And the reason for that is there's going to be a lot of things during a transaction that lawyers have to deal with, not just our little third-party software world. And so the cleaner your bill of health, the easier it is for somebody to look at the list and say, oh, okay, this is all fine. The better the transaction will go for you. And again, remember, number of truly competent open source lawyers is growing. There's a lot more of us, but the most likely situation for now is still that you're going to have an IP generalist on the other side. And I'm doing air quotes, which you can't see for the other side, because really the goal of a transaction is for everything to work out. So, it's adversarial by nature, but it almost isn't. But anyway, you'll have an IP generalist who has probably been scared by someone about the potential viral impact of open source, right? And so they tend to approach this review with the precision of a hand grenade or a cluster bomb, and not sort of the scalpel that we would use, the folks that do this on a daily basis. Sometimes the seller's role in a deal becomes to educate the buyers on why something should be acceptable, right? And sometimes that's not possible, right? Depending on the leverage, the types of organizations involved, it could very well be that you go, hey, this is fine. And the buyers say, yeah, but our policy is that we won't accept this, right? And then that's where OpenChain certification helps you, because what you can say is, look, I'm competent here. I'm certified. I do this the right way. You guys are not market. You're not doing something that's normal. So anything you want me to do that's above and beyond what should be expected, that should be on you. That should be a you problem, not a me problem. Now, on the buyer side of the equation, pre-LOI list is shorter, but it's no less important. The first thing you got to do is you've got to line up your team and advisors, and you got to develop a game plan. So for your internal team, you need legal, business, and development folks. Sometimes that's one person wearing many hats. That does happen. And we see this, by the way, in section 312 of the spec. So even if you're the buyer, right, you're not dealing with your own code base here, the spec is still extremely helpful during transactions. You want contracts in place with your providers, your third-party providers, your code scanning, your security review, your legal review, right? If you want to complete a code scan, and trust me, you want to complete a code scan, you need to kick that off right after you sign the LOI. If you're spending 2 weeks negotiating your agreement with your code scan provider after LOI, you've wasted those 2 weeks. Code scans take time. You don't want to waste that time. And then you need a plan. Right, the specification points us in the right direction with 315. You need a process for reviewing. The difference between your typical in-house review of your own code and your review during a transaction is that during a transaction, you'll never have the kind of time that you need to review everything, right? You're going to run out of time on something in terms of signing generally, and so you need to prioritize. In this case, what we like to do is we like to look at the products, right? So some products are usually more important than others, right? Maybe it's revenue, maybe it's strategic importance. The category of component, right, for third-party components is important. Is it embedded in the product? Is it a development tool, right? Category of third-party license. If you're spending tons of time reviewing for compliance, MIT licensed components pre-signing. In the meantime, there's less permissive licenses out there and you're sort of pushing those off. That's not the right order to do things in. And then you want to tailor the level of review and timing of review, right? So again, some things you can do pre-signing, some things maybe you can push off till post-signing. By doing it this way, by prioritizing things, it also allows you to spot deal breakers early in diligence. Now, I'll tell you right now, in my 12 years, I can't remember a single instance where a deal fell apart because of an open source issue, but there are certainly some that take a lot more to work through, and you want to get to those early, right, rather than late. And then you want to have a substantive plan, right? You want to know what your risk tolerances are for certain licenses, license types, and usages. You don't want to be sitting there as you're asking your diligence questions of the seller and going, hey, what am I going to, they are using GPL in this way. What am I going to do with that? Is that okay? Is that not okay? You sort of want to have a preconceived notion of that before you go into the deal. And then documentation, right? You're never going to get answers to questions you don't know how to ask, right? And so transactions often start with diligence requests. They're sent by the buyer, the seller responds to them, and then you go from there. If your diligence requests don't cover third-party software use, then you're not going to be able to kick that off. You also want to update your reps and warranties. It's a lot easier to have the right reps and warranties in your agreement for third-party software from the word go, rather than doing some diligence going, oh, hey, I don't like the answers. Maybe we'll beef up the reps a little bit. At that point, the lawyers are fighting over every word in the agreement, right? So adding in a whole bunch of stuff about third-party software becomes just a lot more difficult. So for the actual LOI, the letter of intent, let's switch it up and talk about the buy side first. You want to reference the code scan in the LOI. Right. And the reason for that is that it eliminates the surprise and shock of it coming, right? Like I said, scans take time. Let's get that going right away. We like to have a kickoff call when we're on the buy side with the sellers. Helps us learn about the products. It helps us decide how to perform the review, right? Again, you're going to need to figure out which code bases to scan. In this case, one of the things we focus on is the development cumulative, right? If we scan the latest version, is that enough? Or do we need to scan prior versions too to make sure that we get all the third-party software that's in all of those versions? One thing that we need to make sure of is that we're aware of everything that's in every version that's still under support, because if we have to ship a patch to someone that's on an older version that's still under support, that's the code going out the door. We typically push for self-disclosure of known components ahead of the code scan, right? Two reasons for that. One, scans don't pick up everything. I know code scan providers will not like me for saying that, but it's true. Internal tools, for example, development tools are not something that can be picked up usually by a code scan. Commercial components, also more difficult to pick up. And also, other things. So the idea is that you're getting a fuller picture of the third-party software. Also, this lets you tackle some of the issues before the code scan is even complete, right? So you start working through that list. Once the code scan comes back, you net out the duplicates and you just focus on the net new components. This can be used to gauge how well the seller knows their code. When you ask for the list, do they have one, or do they have to go and create one from scratch and then keep updating it every other day when they find more items? You want to address personnel issues. It's a little bit different than on the previous slide. You want to push the seller to disclose the right personnel. You're going to need developers to answer usage questions. And so that's something that sometimes sellers don't quite get. On the seller side here, you have a lot less to do than the buyer, assuming that you've done your pre-LOI tasks. So step one, get legal help. There's a lot of temptation to do this yourself, especially by folks who have a pretty firm grasp of open source software. But the truth is, what you really need is a handle on both the open source software and on how transactions work. And the few in-house people that have this capacity usually don't have the time during the deal, right? They're busy doing other things. And so what happens is that the open source part of the diligence sort of gets pushed off and off and off until you're in a panic at the very end, because now you've got to make your reps, you've got to make your disclosures, and none of that is done. Right. So, it's a bit of a shameless plug here, but get help, right? We're out here to do that. Address personnel issues, like I said on the buy side of the slide. Bring over not just the CTO who's really good at explaining how the product works, but also some of the developers who can say, oh, okay, this component that the scan found, yeah, we don't modify it and we use it in this way, right? Prepare your materials, right? If you've done your code scan, consider whether or not you're going to share those results. Have copies of the policies, have copies of your bills of material ready, have your notice files ready. I tend to avoid just dumping all of that in the data room right away, and waiting to see what the diligence requests will be like, right? If the buyers are only going to ask a sort of light touch set of questions on your third-party software use, giving them a lot more material shows that you're really well prepared, but it might cause them to then say, well, wait a second, now I've got to pause and I've got to review all of this stuff, right? So it can actually backfire a little bit. The next step of a transaction is typically due diligence, right? And there are three main steps, right? And really, I could spend hours just talking about these three steps. And I'm trying to go really quick here. So the three steps are, as I mentioned before, you want to identify all the components, you want to analyze the use, and you want to remediate any non-compliance. And really, that could be code remediation, so removing, rewriting, replacing the code. It could be legal remediation, right? You could be seeking clarification, looking for new licenses, relicensing components. And notice and attribution compliance, right? Something that comes in here. And of course, there's on deals, there's risk mitigation allocation, right? You can have additional reps and warranties. You can have closing conditions. I'll talk about those, as well as specific indemnities and additional escrows in a little bit. So some of the actual due diligence requests that we see are on this slide. Now, for example, for the third-party software policy, you can see how all of these questions are answered by being OpenChain certified, right? You've noticed I've stopped calling out the section numbers, but they are obviously there. In addition to collecting info and reviewing the seller's risk tolerances here that are exhibited by the policy, the buyer is also looking to see what the seller has done, right? What's their grasp here? Great situation if the seller can put the buyer at ease by showing they have a handle on their open source, their third-party software use. Sometimes the buyer's own tech folks, if they recognize that the seller is better at this than they are, they will put pressure on their own legal and deal folks to reduce the level of diligence the seller has to go through. I've been there. I've had tech people come up to me and say, hey, why are we asking the sellers these questions? We don't do this, right? We're not good enough yet to have done this, right? So that's a real thing, and that is very helpful. Small companies like to often think that they don't need a policy, right? There's a small development team. We all know what we're doing. But honestly, it's not that difficult. It's not that expensive to put a policy in place. It's better to have one. So my recommendation is go ahead and make sure you have one. For your list of third-party software components, obviously it matches what I was talking about before, and you want to cast a wide net. So you're requesting everything, components that are included in the product, that are shipped or in production, used in development, infrastructure components. A couple of things to focus on: APIs and data, right? Really important, and things that people often forget are third-party software, or can be third-party software. And then complete versions of actual licenses, right? If there's no notice file, you have to have a mechanism for getting those, because you will need to create a notice file. Open source contributions, I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. And again, this could be an entire separate talk about contributor license agreements, their impact on your patent portfolio and all of that. I won't go into that today, though I'm happy to come back and do that later. But just remember to make sure to cover this, right? Because a lot of people tend to forget that the companies don't just use open source software, they contribute to it. And that's a good thing, that's a great thing, but we need to make sure that it's done the right way. Notice and attribution files, I mentioned before, right? Not unusual to find the seller doesn't have proper notice files, but something that we want to ask for. And then obviously security vulnerabilities, right? Get descriptions of known ones. Good luck. those change obviously very, very frequently. And then we get to the actual agreement, keeping an eye on the clock a little bit here. So what we really want to do is anything that we collected during diligence, we want to capture in our IP reps, because then you have the power of the rep behind all of those disclosures. So if it's incorrect, it's incomplete, you now have a breach of rep claim. IP reps are often fundamental reps, and that means they survive longer, they have higher caps, or perhaps there are no caps for recovery. The first box that you see, the box on the left that you see on the screen here, is your typical no bad open source rep. Right, and we've broken this out into bullets. These are the things that we sometimes include. There are many flavors of a no bad open source rep. Everybody has one that they like, and generally they all work in some fashion. The idea is you haven't used the open source in a way that's created a risk for your proprietary closed source software. The more typical commercial licensed reps are on the right-hand side there, though the second one there, the in compliance, obviously applies to open source as well, but covers audits, payments, and remediation of security vulnerabilities. The other sort of normal rep that we include is a scheduling rep, right? And you'll see that those first two columns, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on them here, they're essentially what we already talked about for diligence requests. The key thing is that we're asking the same stuff. There's no additional material to create. It's already been done through diligence, so there's no additional work for the seller. One thing that the seller does need to remember, especially as you're replying to diligence requests, is that any information you provide, you're going to have to rep to later. So treat it with the appropriate respect as you're doing your diligence stuff. The third table here talks a little bit about APIs and interfaces. Again, very important. Software as a service, right? Things that you use that are other people's SaaS that come with agreements, and we do need to see those and review them. And of course, data and content, and that's incredibly important when we're talking about now with machine learning, model training, AI, right? There's license terms for the data collections themselves. Then there's license terms for the actual data in the data collections. Then there's where did that data come from? What does that data constitute? It's again way beyond the scope of what we have here, but just something that to keep in mind for making sure that that's covered in your agreements. Some other provisions in the agreements: covenants, closing conditions. You want to, as the buyer, you want to remediate any non-compliance, any security issues. You want a clean slate. You want clean code on day one. You, as the buyer, want to say that the code is compliant on your watch, right? Since you've had control of the company, everything was great. Now, obviously, depending on transaction structure, that doesn't erase past liability, but it's a better position to be in. As a seller, you can't really push back on obvious remediation items, right? If you've borrowed somebody's code without attribution, without a license, it needs to come out, for example. But you can't push back against unreasonable requests. And again, this is where if you know what you're talking about, if you're OpenChain certified, if you can show that what you're doing is market and what the seller is asking, or I'm sorry, what the buyer is asking for is not, you can push back a little bit and say, look, I don't want to stop development and do all of this remediation. If you feel this strongly about it, do it after closing when I'm out. Remediation conditions typically work best with split sign and close, because then they can be completed between sign and close, but you can set it up as a deduction of costs from escrow. When that happens, we do like to see both buyers and sellers have to pay a little bit for remediation, if for no other reason than just to make that remediation list shrink a little bit. It's amazing how much shorter the remediation list gets if the buyer realizes they're on the hook for some of the costs too, right? All of a sudden, it's some of those gray items that they weren't so sure about and just decided to remediate come off the list. For indemnification and escrow, again, buyers are going to push for blanket indemnities, right? Like the perfect indemnity for a buyer is a general specific indemnity saying that anything that arises out of the third-party software use, you're on the hook for as the seller. And that's especially true if there appears to be little knowledge on the seller's part as to what's in the code, right? If the code scan found a whole bunch of stuff that the sellers didn't know about, for example, this is something the buyers will push for and say, look, you don't even know what's in there. How can you possibly tell me that I'm supposed to know through diligence? Hard to get, and it's even harder again if you as the seller do know what you're talking about and can show that, look, reasonable people are not going to think that what I'm doing is wrong. So therefore, I'm not going to provide you any indemnification whatsoever. Basically, I took the risk while I was running the business. You're going to take the risk once you're running the business. One final thing that I want to mention, and I'll mention it very quickly, is rep and warranty insurance, right? Growing area, we're seeing this a lot more now. Insurers will typically want to see the results of diligence before they'll before they'll issue a policy that covers third-party software related reps. Unusual for the insurer themselves to ask additional questions, but they want to make sure that you asked yours as the buyer. They want to make sure diligence was done. One thing to be careful of here is that typically specific indemnities and remediation items are going to be excluded from the insurance policy. So if you're a buyer and the seller's not providing you any escrow or any coverage for these, so the only coverage is the policy itself, then you want to think carefully about what you include for indemnification, what you include for remediation, because now the only coverage is carved out from the insurers. And that's it. That's my talk. Like I said, I'm happy to answer questions. I know I didn't leave a lot of time here, but we'll have some time later on after all of our presentations. You can always reach me. My contact info is here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Leon, first of all, that was incredible. That was information dense but clear. And it's got a reaction from our audience. We've got 2 questions in. I'd love if we could address them now before we move on to the security topic with Jan. So, I'll throw them over to you. The first was from Yari, and he was saying, often at the sell side, the number of people involved is very limited and developers are not part of the deal team. Can the buyer ask or demand to have a developer on the call?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And it's absolutely true, right? It's hard to get developers disclosed on deals, but usually a small limited number of developers does have to be disclosed. And absolutely the buyers can sort of demand and say, hey, look, we can't do the diligence part of this. We can't proceed with the work that we need to do without getting somebody on your side who can answer these questions.
That's brilliant. And Alex came in with another question. So he saw a bullet point on one of your slides saying, the company has remediated all security vulnerabilities. And he was just saying, it's really hard to reconcile that with continued innovation. It's incredibly hard to certify that's what's going on. Is it reasonable to have a middle ground saying that the company has remediated for important, serious, or easily exploitable vulnerabilities?
Yeah, and I think I sort of made a joke there about good luck with that particular bullet point, and that's precisely why Alex is absolutely right. Because vulnerability, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that you're not necessarily going to fix, and there's a lot that maybe you don't need to fix, right? So it's a good starting point to start there. But yeah, that's usually where you end up, is some sort of compromise. And it always, as with anything on a deal, right, it depends on leverage, which sort of direction this gets pushed into. But one thing that I want to stress, and again, deals by their nature, people think of them as adversarial, right? You've got lawyers on one side, you got lawyers on the other side, everybody's butting heads. But at the end of the day, right, it's going to be a merger. These people are going to come in, they're going to work in the same company. This product needs to succeed, right? So nobody wants to create a situation where we grind everything to a halt. We're fixing things that don't need to be fixed, right? So usually, right, there's reasonableness that can be expected, and a path forward does emerge.
Right. And this dovetails, I guess, with something Chris mentioned in the chat, just on the sidebar. Just, you could limit it to commonly known and reported vulnerabilities at time of sale, or a similar way of slicing it up that you both meet in the middle on.
Right.
All right, Leon, that's brilliant. Naturally, we'll be coming back to this topic at the panel, but let's let's dive right into the next phase and bring Jan up to talk about, well, essentially how we address M&A from the perspective of security. Jan, the floor is yours. Just so you know, your current one.
Yeah,
there we go.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Let me try to share my screen so that I can.
And while Jan is sharing, just remember that there's a Q&A function available in Zoom. You'll find it at the menu bar at the bottom, and you're very welcome to throw in questions at any time, and we'll address them at the end of each talk and or at the panel.
I will check. Well, is it also possible to share a single window?
It should be. When you click share screen, it should open.
It has a basic one, and then it's offering me iPhones and key. Here, this
just below that should be.
Let's try this one. What are you going to see? It's dangerous.
This could be exciting, everyone. Hit record now.
Oh no, I need to go to the system management to allow this. Here. I'll take this one and allow this one.
I'll be
back in a second. I need to just jump off.
No problem. We'll be here. This is our continued online reminder to everyone that if you can crack conferencing software, you're going to make $1 trillion. So we've been running a poll. I'm going to run a couple of polls during this talk, and the first poll was just to ask why people are here, and we've had 53% of people respond. And it's interesting. We've had, a certain amount of people, around 10%, saying that they buy companies. They're here because they're interested in that. But 48% are people who help organizations buy or sell companies. And we have 43% just curious, just hanging out. That's an interesting indicator of where we are with the market interest and who's on board live right now. I'll run a couple more polls before this event is done to give us some more snapshots of what's going on and why. And just as a side note, as this event goes on, if you have any questions that you don't put in the Q&A, don't forget there's also the live chat on the side where you can dive in and say hello to everyone and just shoot the breeze. We were currently talking about visiting museums in San Diego. And greetings from around the world as people dial in. Now, if Jan has a bit of difficulty re-entering to share, we'll skip to the next presentation, but we'll give him another minute here. I'm going to end our first poll. So that's locked down now. And we will have our second poll a little bit later. We still don't have Jan here, so we give him another minute and then we'll hop to the next presentation. Those of you who've dialed in from Asia, thank you very much for being part of this. I do know it's very late for all parties involved. It's nearly midnight here in Japan, which means our good friends in China are running at nearly 11 p.m. All right, Jan seems to be having some difficulty re-entering. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump forward straight away to Hendrik, if that's all right with you, Hendrik, and you're all set. If not, we'll continue to wait for Jan.
Sure, I'm all set, so
all right.
Start.
It is your floor. So everyone, we're jumping ahead to Hendrik. We're going to be talking about checking compliance with Foss matrix. And Hendrik from Osborne Clark is going to walk us through that. Thanks for stepping up a little bit early, Hendrik. Much appreciated. Your screen is sharing just fine.
Okay, perfect. So I hope everyone can see what I'm presenting. I'm a bit concerned that this should not slip too much into a product presentation. However, I want to emphasize the way we went to where we are now, and why this may also be an option for others who are currently listening and interested in this. So we've heard quite a lot now from the, let's say, pure legal side when it comes to M&A transactions and open source or, well, third-party software. I would also recommend to speak of third-party software, by the way, instead of just focusing on open source, because any IP-related code snippet, anything that's copyrightable and protectable, should be scanned, should be tested, should be assessed, no matter if it's open source, shareware, freeware, however you call it. So whenever it comes to automation, or whenever it comes to open source compliance, automation is of course an issue, and it's definitely an issue worth looking at when it comes to the legal parts. Why is that? Well, in many cases, first step you do, and you know this using the standard tools, is to identify what's in the package. You do a bulk scan, you do a more detailed scan. However, you do a scan, and then you know a number of licenses, a number of components, a number of vulnerabilities you get. But for the legal guys, then actually the work starts to begin, because just a list of licenses is nice to have. However, you have to understand what does it mean in practice. So suddenly you will have to deal with a large bunch of licenses, with a large number of components, and this is definitely something which is difficult, because most scanning tools identify the licenses, but they don't identify any obligations, any license obligations. This is nothing that's covered, or at least it's only covered in a very basic way. And it's something where the legal hard work begins. But if you want to be compliant, or if you want to check whether a company is compliant, you have to, well, actually check all legal obligations, all licenses, and then you have to match them against your use case, because it's not an abstract license. It's usually bound to certain requirements, and once the requirements are fulfilled, specific obligations will arise from that. And then finally, time is of the essence, of course. You will have to check a large number of licenses in a very short time frame. And this can, of course, only be done on a high-level basis. You will not be able to go deeper into detail. As with any due diligence process, you will have to focus on the low-hanging fruits and on the red flags. So in most cases, what we see in a due diligence, you focus on copyleft licenses, GPL, LGPL, and all the likes, and you focus on the bill of materials, which means are all information requirements fulfilled, are the requirements complied with, and then it's usually it. However, in practice, in many cases, you ignore quite important obligations or prohibitions or any additional requirements that may make a difference in practice. For instance, there are the so-called Drm provisions or devaluation, as you know, with the GPL v3. It's one issue. You're not allowed to use GPL v3 code in systems if it's a user product that prohibit change of the code. For instance, an iPhone would already be an issue. But there are other licenses that have similar provisions that are in many cases ignored or simply not cared with. You have additional information requirements, which means you have licenses that require not just to provide a software bill of materials, but to provide additional information, for instance, within the software itself. So it's not sufficient just to create an SBOM. You will have to create specific displays, specific marks within your software. And that, of course, well, is something that should be taken care of prior to putting the product on the market. And then it's also been said already, there are some commercial licenses that do contain specific restrictions, specific license metrics that are not known or common in an open source context. So any limitations in quantity, any limitations with regard to distribution or further downstream distribution, all these requirements have to be taken care of. And as we are dealing with these questions, not every now and then, but actually on a permanent basis, I would say, we asked ourselves, wouldn't there be any kind of way to just describe a use case and then let this be checked against the tool? Wouldn't it be possible to say, okay, we know certain licenses, we've seen them in the wild quite frequently, we just assess them once, and then we set up a solution in order to have it checked automatically? We said, yes, should be possible. However, as with lawyers, you know, the famous, most famous answer, at least that's a German saying, is it depends. Whenever you ask, is it true or false? And of course, we soon came to the same situation where we said, well, okay, some obligations, some requirements are quite easy to answer. However, there are other requirements where you can't say just yes or no. There's a large gray area. There are lots of open questions, disputes, discussions. And even though it's perceived in the open source community that there is lots of case law and lots of court decisions, in the lawyers community, actually, we've got quite the opposite understanding or impression. Yes, there is some case law. Yes, some questions have been dealt with. However, many questions are still open. So, for instance, when does the copyleft effect apply? I mean, regardless of different licenses and their scope, but even just one single decision would already be helpful. There's none to my knowledge by now. There were some decisions or some court cases pending where it was discussed, but at least I'm not aware of any decision yet on the very scope, apart from one or two very narrowed down questions, but not in a way that it would be helpful in broader practice. So we soon came to the conclusion it's not feasible to simply say yes or no. You have to put some grayish into the whole system. And this is why we tried to at least split up certain questions into sub-questions, so to speak. So one question that we're frequently asked is it possible to use a specific software in an ASP or software as a service scenario? So is it possible to provide software as a service, to give access to it via terminal session, via any kind of VPN, via any mechanism that allows handling of the software without having the copy executed on the own computer? What did we do? We split down these questions into parts, into smaller parts. We weighed the questions with different score values. We said, well, there are strong arguments for or against ASP use. There are weak arguments. And then we simply bound this or tied this to score values and calculated out of the answer specific scores, which then gave an estimate on how reliable the answer would be. So would you say, yes, I'm 100% sure it's possible because I have an explicit language, explicit clause in the license, or is it just something where I would say, well, there are some arguments, but maybe not the best ones. So this is how we try to reduce the complexity by cropping this down to a single question and then adding a score value to it. And essentially, with regard to the ASP scenario, we boiled it down in two scenarios. We said, or two questions. First of all, is ASP use as such permitted under a specific license? And if so, does this ASP use trigger the respective obligations? Why is that? In many cases, when it comes to a due diligence, you would stop at the moment where the company says, well, we are only using the software internally, or we are only using or providing the software as a service. It's nothing that's installed on-premise at a customer. It's only running in the cloud, and the customer accesses the software within this cloud. And in this case, in many at least case in practice where we have been advising, we heard from the other side, well, no ASP, no software as a service, so no obligations under open source licenses. And I think you all know that's not the complete truth, as we would say in Germany. There may be some truth in it, as many licenses will probably not apply. However, there are, of course, licenses that have exactly this ASP scenario in mind. Think of the SSPL, think of the AGPL and other respective licenses. They do apply in such a scenario. So it would not help simply to say, okay, we stop our assessment here and just deliver some green flags where actually a yellow or maybe even a red one should be raised. So in this case, excuse me, we broke down the ASP question into specific single questions, starting with, of course, the explicit license provision. if there is any language in the license, this would be the best argument for or against such ASP use being allowed. In most cases, you don't have it because many licenses are simply too old. Then you have official statements of product owners, license stewards, when you check the components as such. Maybe you have statements from anyone being involved in the software development or drafting the license. Or you have any kind of references or other hints towards ASP being allowed, or you even know that there are some use cases where respectively licensed software is used in the form of ASP. And these are the questions you would have to answer, and you'd have to check in order to be able to answer the question, is ASP used allowed or not? So in the end, what was very important to us, and this of course does also help when it comes to putting some flesh to the bones, some meat to the bones, is to understand and to track and also to assess the reasoning behind it. So what we did is to put extensive language or to track extensive language with regard to every single argument. So here, for instance, you see just the question, is there an ASP provision in the license text? I think it's the GPL 2.0. You're not supposed to read it now. Only thing is, you can see there is some discussion about the ASP scenario and GPL. And for us, it was essential, as said, to track these discussions, to be able to reread it, and of course also to enable our clients to reread it, because simply to say, well, you have an issue here, or you do have a red flag here, is not that sufficient, or at least not quite convenient. It would be much more helpful if you could say, well, and this is why we came to the conclusion, and this is how you can fix it. So these questions were all then condensed in one big table, and this is something you can do, of course, as well when you're dealing on a frequent basis with open source licenses. We structured this into specific single elements, and then we boiled it down to the use cases. And these use cases we were handling in attributes. So you see here lots of questions for just two small columns: is ASP use allowed or not? And if so, does it trigger the license obligations? In the end, you can come up with percentage values. I'm not going into detail here. It's simply the background is once you've set it up in an automated way, it helps, of course, dramatically to increase the speed. So here you can see the effect on choosing specific use cases. Whenever you say, okay, I have to have the possibility to provide it in ASP form, then all ASP licenses or licenses that trigger specific obligations or even prohibitions in case of ASP create a red flag, while other licenses don't. So that's something which helps you to assess the licenses on a large scale and also in very short time frames. So of course, you can imagine that you can use it for automatically flagging red flags, then checking it manually, recheck it in order to be able to say, well, do I have an issue here, or do I not have an issue? And this dramatically improves, first of all, quality of such checks. You would not simply be reduced to the mere SBOM check or copyleft license assessment, but it would be a little bit more. So what do we suggest to do in an M&A due diligence when it comes to license assessments or reviews? First of all, of course, you focus on the high-level assessment. You don't go into detail with every legal agreement that you check within the course of a due diligence process. You know better yourself if you're dealing with this on a frequent basis. You just go for a high-level review. You don't go into the details unless, of course, you have something prepared. On the seller side, whenever it comes to selling a company, you take the low-hanging fruits first, which means you take the ones the buyer would look at almost, well, where it's almost sure that the buyer would look at it. So GPL licenses should be taken care of. Copyleft should be assessed. In case there are any copyleft licenses, you have to have a story to tell why the copyleft does not apply, how you handle the copyleft effect, and how you manage to avoid its application. And the information requirements, they are ignored in most cases. Many companies focus on the copyleft question and say, well, I don't want my company code to be infected, don't want to get it covered by GPL software. Yes, that's one part of the story, but in practice, at least in Germany here, we are frequently dealing with case law simply based on lack of compliance with information requirements. So you have to have an SBOM, a software bill of materials. You have to have all the information collected that you need with that regard, license text, copyright notices, and so forth. And these are the most important issues that should be fixed. One thing is the SBOM requirements in many cases can't be fixed that easily, and so it can't be fixed that quickly, as you would undergo, of course, a larger compliance process, scanning, compiling all the information, and so forth. So sometimes that's something which is done as a, which is simply defined as a post-closing condition. On the buyer side, then, of course, you just don't look at the low-hanging fruits. You also look at the higher-hanging fruits, so to speak. So we already mentioned DRM provision. Are there any obligations with that regard? There are other licenses besides GPL v3, for instance, Creative Commons licenses that have the same provisions. Are licenses triggered by ASP? If you are in an ASP context, that should be taken care of. Because that's always a very good argument in order to open the pricing discussion again. If you find any issues there, you can say, well, okay, if there's no compliance with regard to the main asset of the company, if software is the main asset, of course, then we'll have to talk about pricing again. And we had lots of cases where suddenly we were quite successful in entering into the discussion again, simply due to missing open source compliance, due to missing clarification and then clearance on the question who owns the IP, where did the IP come from. So we had projects where simply somebody took it from the internet, just took Apache licensed code, and then by some magic that we did not understand, this Apache license code was turned into a proprietary software and a proprietary code, or at least part of it. And so this is, of course, always a good entering point for pricing discussions. Of course, you should differentiate between use cases. So whenever you use software internally, then it's a complete different story. If you distribute software, it's a different story. If you use it as a cloud service only, it's a different story. But I only can recommend to look closely to the very software. In many cases, you suddenly have parts of code that are distributed in a web application, for instance, simply because it's JavaScript, or you have applets being exchanged, or you have some ads running in the background. So all this should be checked. And then you, of course, have to have a tailor-made tailored process with regard to these use cases. So not all copyleft licenses are bad. If you just use software internally, copyleft is perfectly acceptable, as it's simply not being triggered by internal use. So that's something you would have to check. And of course, one more comment: asset deal and share deal makes a difference. So whenever you sell the company as such, no transfer of licenses takes place. You should know this. Whenever it comes to an asset deal and only single assets of the company, software being among them, is transferred to a third party, it has to be treated like a third party distribution of the whole software, and this has to be, of course, possible from a legal perspective. In many cases, then we end up by saying, okay, we performed a high-level scan. We checked some of the compliance artifacts for plausibility. So we checked the software bill of materials. We found some gaps. We found missing licenses. We found missing version numbers, whatever. And then you fix it later, not in order to get the whole process stuck. You simply define that all this has to be cleaned up in a later, at a later point in time. Of course, do not miss the essence or the essentials. So IP rights should be clarified. It should be clear who is owning the IP. But when it comes to the details, third-party components, missing software bill of materials, this usually can be done later. Well, and just by using our tool, we then came to a solution which is not that small anymore these days. So we have a larger number of licenses in this tool, about 200 licenses, classified by about 54 attributes, which means all single questions. Where specific license obligations come into play. And then you simply map this against use cases. So in the end, the legal check of these licenses would actually be 5 steps. And this is actually a process, regardless of whether you can automate it or not, that should be complied with. First of all, you have to define use cases, which means how do you use the software? Is it distributed, internally used? Is it used in ASP? Are patents a threat to you because you have your own patent portfolio, or can you simply ignore the patent related questions in the licenses, and so forth? Then, of course, second step, you have to identify the licenses being applicable. You have to choose one of the use cases you defined. What are you doing with the software, or maybe even more use cases depending on the component. Speaking about the back end, which runs internally. Is it an app which is distributed to customers or to clients? You match the license against the use case profile. So you say, okay, you have to check, does the license cause any issues in a DRM environment? Does the license cause issues in ASP? And that's mainly it. Well, as I said, we have kind of a solution that simply does this in a standardized way. But of course, it's up to you. What I just want to emphasize at this point in the M&A process, without any automation, it's hard to achieve results on a large scale. And whenever such M&A process, due diligence process takes place on a repeated basis, it's a very good idea to think about tools. And it's not just about scanning software. It's not just about identifying what's in my code base, but it's also what legal obligations to apply. How can the legal obligations be complied with? Lawyers tend to write long texts, and I tend to speak without any interruption here. But so what usually has been done, and this is not quite helpful, at least that's our experience, is simply to write long memos about the legal implications of the software or the licenses. We would prefer it in a structured way, and we just found out that such a structured way helps in practice the client, but of course us as the advisors as well. Whenever you can get a quick overview over the license structure, over main obligations, obstacles, that's very helpful. So that was actually it. I'm happy to take your questions, and thank you first of all for listening and for the opportunity here to present this way on how we deal with open source software.
Henrik, thank you so much. That was great. We did have one question in from Dirk. He was talking about the ASP use case example. He wanted to ask, isn't it a two-step process? First of all, the use case is a distribution, and then the obligations of a distribution under the license.
Yes, I mean, when you come to distribution, you can take it from two ways, actually. Sometimes it's the main question is captured in a way where you would say, can ASP use be regarded as distribution? So if you shift it that way, yes, you would ask yourself, is distribution covering ASP? We took a slightly different approach and simply asked ourselves, does the license somehow capture ASP use in terms of distribution? Capture ASP use as such. If it can be covered by, or if it is covered by the term distribution in the license, then it's fine. But sometimes you have different license obligations that would not mention distribution as such, but would also cover ASP. So it's not distribution first, at least we would not see it that way. We would say it's distribution, or it can be ASP, either or. And then the question is, do the license obligations apply?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the excellent presentation. Much appreciated. So we're going to come back to some of those topics in the panel, but right now we're going to pull Jan up to talk about M&A and security. So Jan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you again. And hopefully this time I will be more successful in trying to share my screen. So let's see how to get it done this time. I could always this.
And while Jan's getting that rolling, we're going to have some great questions heading into the panel. Hendrik, we've got a few questions coming for you that we'll open our panel with and run through those.
Sure. Should we do it now, or?
You could do it now because I'm still searching for the sharing.
All right,
button.
let's go for the first one. We have an anonymous attendee asking a question. Why would you recommend a high-level code scan? Why not get the most out of the scan or audit snapshot and be as sure as possible of the acquired risks?
Well, in practice, of course, we would always go for the best, most precise way, detailed code scan if possible. However, in many cases, time is simply of the essence. So whenever it's said, okay, closing has to be within the next few days, you simply have the choice to do nothing at all, to do it halfway, or to get a high-level scan. Sure, whenever a client says, please go into detail, we would do so. How many in practice? This sometimes ends up in contacting software developers, taking a look at websites simply in order to check what are the software developers saying about their website, about the code, about the license. And that's why we say, okay, better to get quick results and results at all instead of nothing at all. But I completely agree. Whenever there's a possibility to do so, definitely we should do it.
There's a second question here, which is from Yari. And this question is, how about applications that are mostly software as a service, but some parts like JavaScript are distributed? Are you splitting these in two? So the software as a service part and distributed part for analysis, or are you bundling everything together?
We would actually split it in two. So we would say, okay, one use case, internal use or ASP use, and the other use case, distribution. And then we would assess both packages differently. You take a look at the distribution use case, of course, with a much on a much closer level, because in this case, most of the license obligations are triggered. And then the backend scenario or the service scenario, you would have to check, are there any obligations mainly arising from commercial licenses like indirect use or anything comparable. But in most cases, the open source issues open source licenses do not cause too much issues there.
That's great. Thank you. And there's one final question we'll come to for the panel. So we'll leave it for now and we'll get back to that in the panel. Hendrik, thank you so much. And now let's dive into M&A with security from Jan.
So thank you very much. And this time I'm able to share my screen. That's even with Zoom. I'm absolutely happy. In this talk, I want to give you a few more thoughts, and Leon already scratched at one of them. But before that, let me say a few words where I'm coming from. EACG is a consulting company. We're quite a while in the business now, and our focus is on helping customers getting actually digital. So that started in the e-commerce world in 20 years ago. And now we are actually more in the product business, in the machinery world. And since we are architects, we have also a lot to do to be on the assessment side, going for cloud and security compliance, but also software and security compliance. And this is actually where we have met the thoughts and ideas of OpenChain. And what we try to address with the solution that we have developed called TrustSource. And TrustSource is actually going from the scanning, import-export of documentation, vulnerability matching, and addressing the complete solution, not only what you get in your software build, but also additional materials like containers and other environments, and put all this into an audit capability. And that's where we meet actually with the OpenChain specification. And that we cover and make available the whole process across the life cycle. And this is probably something that comes into more attention, or should get more attention than it has probably today. We have a lot of trends that are driving into that life cycle vision or life cycle understanding of software. When you look at the White House executive order in last May, or even the medical device regulation, the changes that have happened there from the EU, all these are requesting the provider of a software to take responsibility for it even while it is in the field. And I do think that this is a trend that will continue, because the more complex the software is, the less likely that someone who is buying it or some user is able to manage it. And so there's two things that I think need to be highlighted, and especially when you are in an M&A context and you're buying something that is producing software, it should be in your focus as well. The first is the software production process, and the second are the in-field installations. And then not only the situation as of today is relevant for your risk that you're buying, but also the past. So how good has been the target in the past? How has it managed the stuff before they even thought about selling the stuff? And this is something that is addressed pretty well by when we talk about the software supply chain. We have this this procedure, and what you see here is actually a diagram that is provided by the Linux. It's another work group from the Linux Foundation. It's the SLSA, and it's pretty new. They are in the specification status of version 0.1, and they aim to address all risks that are associated with the building of software. And I think they made a very good job, at least in the very first beginning. They have now very precise analysis of the different steps that are in such a supply chain. And it can give you a great framework if you want to assess such a supply chain. So they separated different threat classes and describe actually the threats that are associated with each of these steps, and also tend to develop mitigation approaches so that you can then use this information to check and verify the process of software building at your target. And I think probably in quite a while, it is also possible to look out for certifications. I'm not sure whether they are really going for third-party certification, but at least they qualified in this framework different levels of sophistication, and said, okay, for example, scripting automation is a very basic thing. If this is done in the build process, you can have a certain reliance. And if you have, for example, included certain particular vulnerability scans, or not only vulnerability scans, but also other security scans, which are probably even more important than the pure known vulnerabilities. So they are able to give you a frame to judge the risk or the remaining risk that is resulting from the current procedures that they are using to build the software that you are going to buy. And I would suggest for those who are going to buy to use this sort of framework to make it kind of checklist or developer sort of questionnaire that you want your target to complete so that you get an understanding of the risk that is associated with that sort of software. All this is available online. The link has been given on one of the slides, and it's really worth a read, and I'm keen to see what the outcome will be from the growing of that sort of specification. The second thing that I want to address is the in-field software. It's pretty clear that targets are about to polish and beautify and make them make the nice bright. And so probably they're even invested into something that made the latest version good looking, and probably even then this is a very, very secure build because they invested into providing good code. But when you look into something, a software company that really is dealing with distributed software, then most likely you will find a huge amount of versions out there that are pretty much old. These are the ones that are actually giving the value, because they are the old installations. They are giving the cash value that the company probably is worth. And only a very small part will be already updated. And I think it's important to have this in mind when you look into such a company. So probably it's important to understand the distribution, how the cash flow is based on what kind of license versions. Because when only the improvements for security checks and everything has been done, let's in this sample for the version 3, you still have quite a big chunk of business that's depending on old versions. And you must, to maintain this, you also must take care for the validity and the security of all these older versions. And this, I think, is something that might be more critical given the software supply chain capabilities have been set up in the latest version only. So that's why having an understanding of how does the cash flow distribute across older versions, and how are the status of software bill of materials in these older versions seen. This is something that really makes a new dimension, and also helps to judge the risk that is really associated with the target. And that's why I really recommend to ask for not only the latest software bill of materials, but also earlier software bill of materials. And the information that you get from these and see the delta between these two will help you to understand the improvements on the software build cycle. So do they already invested into this years ago? Then most likely you are on the safe side. But if you see that the bills of materials from version 2.3 still are pretty messy, while 3.0 is looking nice, then most likely you might buy some more risk. And then, yeah, I mean, these are the two thoughts that I want to bring to you concerning the software security when you are on the buying side. And there's one thing that has been developed by actually this working group, the OpenChain Security Assurance Guide. The OpenChain Security Assurance Guide has been designed. It's actually a little bit similar to the OpenChain open source compliance guide. It has a similar structure. It has actually more or less four different aspects. It's focusing on the same thing, like it's also having some foundational things. There must be policy, there must be competence, there must be awareness ensured. So this is, it must be have a clear scope, and there should be a definition or an understanding of what is the standard that we are looking at. There must be also a publicly accessible endpoint to manage security or to report security incidents. And it is ensured that also requested that you have enough resources that are able to fulfill these requirements. And finally, it also requires to have the software bill of materials generated and handled, like the original specification already is requesting as well. But in addition, it requires some security assurance per each component that appears in these SBOMs, and requires procedures and processes to detect and handle critical impacts resulting from these incidents or known vulnerabilities that are identified per component. In addition, and that's a very important thing, I think, it requires you to take care for the former releases, so for software in the field. That's, I think, a very useful thing. If you did not do so, you should definitely have a look at it, and you should take care that you follow up with these suggestions there. It's also in the checklist style, as you know it from the OpenChain specification already. And wherever you want to have a standard practice implementation for how you do this, you could look out how SLSA is going to develop and how you can address this in your processes and build this into your reviews, because I think here is really, it's making the difference. That's clearly identifying what needs to be done, and requirements are straightforward to verify. Also, the reference materials are mentioned here clearly. So feel free to ask questions. Yeah, looking forward for your thoughts.
Thank you, Jan. That was a really interesting talk. We had some people jump in with a few notes and so on in the chat section. Let me try and pull up one. Most of these notes are most relevant to the panel, I think. So what we're going to do then is we're going to jump from Jan into the next speaker, and we'll come back to these Q&A in the panel session. Once again, thank you so much, Jan, for giving us a security deep dive. And we're going to continue now looking at the sustainability of open source licenses with Andreas from Pwc. Andreas, are you okay to grab the screen and start sharing?
Yeah, does it show?
Perfect. Everything is working great.
So thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending our webinar. My name is Andreas Kutula. I'm the founder of Pwc, a company focusing on software analytics and open source management. And I've been working in the era of open source compliance now for more than a decade, helping customers to identify open source, understand the implications, and manage the usage of open source. Today, I'm going to discuss something that we have recently seen appearing more and more often, especially in open source projects that are driven by commercial organizations. We have observed that some of the open source projects have changed their license terms from a permissive license to a more restrictive license. My presentation analyzes some prominent examples, gives background information on the reasons, as well as reactions from the community, and concludes with the recommendations on some points you should consider when you select an open source license. You may know experienced developers do not write new source code completely themselves. They reuse code fragments from the internet. This increases the speed of the development and the quality of the software. If we look at the last few years, it is very interesting to see how, on the one hand, the use of open source is changing, and also the awareness about the use of open source. In the last 5 to 10 years, open source has established itself as the standard in software development, both for self-used systems and products that are distributed. No matter what industry you are in, automotive, healthcare, IoT, teaching, and also no matter what development model is used, software as a service or traditional product development, open source is everywhere. Our data shows that of a typical product, at least half of the code is open source, if not more. And that's a big shift, both in usage and in awareness. Open source software is now everywhere and has become indispensable for modern software development. Open source is driven by communities. The projects which make the source code freely available are either kept alive by individual developers or supported by a broad community or managed by individual companies as a business model. Even in case of a larger project community, some projects are mainly funded and maintained by commercial organizations. Open source does not mean that the use of the code is allowed without any restrictions, and we just have heard about that a lot. The use is subject to conditions which are formulated by the author or the copyright holder in a form of a license. The most business permissive form of the usage is called public domain. This is when the author of the software gives away the copyright as well as any other legal restrictions and makes it belong to the public. The first Bitkom guide on open source software gives the following clarification about open source usage. Usage, duplication, and processing are not permitted without conditions, because in the case of open source software, the granting of rights of use is often made dependent on certain conditions. Now, when we look at commercial organizations that open source their code, this is usually driven by business reasons rather than altruistic behavior. For example, to increase the market footprint or to simplifying the access to the software, to sell additional services or to upsell additional features only available in commercial versions of the software. Companies whose business center on the development of open source software employ a variety of business models to solve the challenge of how to make money providing software that is by definition licensed free of charge. Each of these businesses' strategies rests on the premise that the user of open source technology is willing to purchase additional software features under proprietary license, or purchase other services or elements of value that complement the open source software that is core to the business. This additional value can be, but is not limited to, enterprise-grade features, uptime guarantees to satisfy business or compliance requirements, performance and efficiency gains by features not available in the open source version, legal protection or professional support, training or consulting that are typical of proprietary software applications. Historically, these business models started in the late 90s and early 2000s as dual licensing models, for example, MySQL, and have matured over time to include many variations. Pure dual licensing models are not uncommon, as a more nuanced business approach to open source software business models have developed. The Commercial Open Source Software Index, a list of commercial open source companies, illustrates that several businesses have reached at least $100 million in revenue. Notable examples include OpenCore, which is sometimes also referred to as dual licensing or multiple licensing, software as a service, freemium, donation-based funding, crowdfunding, and crowdsourcing. The acceptance of these approaches varies. Some of these approaches are recommended, others are accepted, while still others are considered controversial or even unethical by the open source community. The underlying objective of these business models is to harness the size and international scope of the open source community, typically more than an order of magnitude larger than would be achieved without or with a closed source software for a sustainable commercial venture. The vast majority of commercial open source companies experience a conversion rate well below 1%. So that means measured by the percentage of downloaders who buy something. So low cost and high scalability marketing and sales functions are key to these firms' profitability. So what is happening? Recently, we have observed some open source projects maintained by commercial companies have changed their license conditions from a rather business friendly to a more restrictive license in newer versions of the software. Elastic, for example, which is a real-time search server based on Apache Lucene, or Redis, an in-memory database. MongoDB is another example for database, or Grafana, a graphical representation of data. All of these should be mentioned here. All of them adapted their licensing models to more restrictive licenses. The reasons for that appear to be similar: to force current users, especially non-paying businesses, to purchase commercial licenses of those open source products. A fair question you may ask is, why? Why do they change the license models? And there are several reasons for that. Number one is that most of the projects were started by private individuals, and making money for these was not the main purpose why they created those projects. The second reason is adaption. If open source licenses were too restrictive, it would be harder to convince developers to use the software in their code. Finally, it was not until the late 2020s when enterprise software started to heavily migrate into the cloud. And hence most licenses from earlier times did not have terms regulating the use as software as a service. Even today, the vast majority of open source licenses are not putting any significant restriction on the use of software in the cloud. However, it is pretty clear that today most applications are running as services and can greatly benefit from the software under those older licenses. In addition to the commercial reasons, there's one more important aspect. Free-to-use open source did not motivate companies to contribute back to the open source community. And hence, they had become free riders on a train where some passengers paid a lot and some paid nothing at all, neglecting the basic principles of open source, which is based on mutual exchange. In its statement, Redis said, cloud vendors contribute very little, if anything, to open source projects. In contrast, they would generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue from them, causing harm to the open source community and even driving some companies out of the market. Redis had first switched some modules to a common clause license model, but a short time later, the company introduced the Redis source available license. MongoDB also decided to switch to the server-side public license. One concrete example I want to talk about is Elasticsearch. On January 14, 2021, a blog post was published on the Elastic's website titled Licensing Change. In this blog post, they announced the license changed in the next release of all their tools, including Elastic and Kibana. The purpose of this change is mainly to block AWS. Elastic wants to make it impossible for AWS to create its own competing managed Elasticsearch service. The announced changes were not very well received in the open source world. If you do not know about the company Elastic, it is a company behind one of the largest search engines called Elasticsearch. The company was founded in Amsterdam and is worth billions on the stock exchange in the US. Elasticsearch is their main product, but many other products have emerged around it. Elasticsearch started as a fully open source product, just like some of their other projects, like Kibana, Logstash, or Beats. Elasticsearch started as an Apache 2 project. The Apache 2 license was replaced by the server-side public license. The SSPL has been developed by MongoDB, and the reason for that was to make it impossible for Amazon to make the Elasticsearch managed service available. Elastic has drawn up agreements with a number of large cloud providers such as Google and Microsoft Azure about their services to offer Elastic products as a managed service. However, the negotiations with AWS did not go anywhere. Now, what is the impact for you if you want to use Elasticsearch in your project? There is no clear answer to that. If you already had some form of contract with Elastic, nothing will change. If you previously only used the binaries, not a lot will change either. Maybe you should check whether you comply with the license. When you build a service based on Elastic products, make extensions to this and offer them as a service in the cloud, this will impact you. The new Elastic license clearly excludes that such service may be offered to third parties as a managed service. And what are the implications to end users? These changes have generated a lot of friction between existing users of the software and the current open source maintainers. In the case of Redis, for example, the main reason for the friction was that Redis disallowed commercial distribution of the software Redis, even if Redis was provided by a third party. In other words, if your cloud provider allowed you to use Redis and you have built your application around it, after that license change, you were now required to pay Redis for the commercial use of the software. Another reason for a license change is provided by Grafana, which switched from Apache to the AGPL. According to the company, the license change is intended to ensure fair use of the open source software. The AGPL still allows the free use and further development of the product. Compared to the GPL, it closes the so-called ASP loophole through which companies would not have to release the source code for purely hosted versions of the software. Anaconda also recently introduced a commercial license for the users who used the software very intensively. This refers to those users who mirror the repository on a large scale or whose CI/CD and development systems regularly make thousands of package downloads. Anaconda co-founder Peter Wang said, "At this point, Anaconda alone is bearing the cost of packaging, testing, and monthly bandwidth costs in the petabyte range. I trust that our commercial users understand that it is no longer reasonable for us to offer this service at zero cost." Now, what are the implications of this for you as the user of open source? When selecting an open source package, we recommend paying attention to not only the richness of functional parameter and how actively it is maintained. Also, what is the community behind the project and who is maintaining the project is an important factor. If an open source project depends only on one or a few developers or is mainly driven by a single company, the risk of an unexpected license change with some effects on your business is much higher than if a broad community supports the project. Another good way to assess if a project is a good fit for your business is to evaluate if you or your company can get involved in the community and actively support those projects that are relevant to you, thus trying to secure a certain influence on the project. This brings me to the last slide already, just a short summary. So we have heard open source is everywhere. And recently, some open source projects maintained by commercial companies have changed their license conditions from a rather business-friendly to a more restrictive license. This caused friction on end users and maintainers. So what is important for you when you choose open source software, do a careful risk evaluation, include analyzing contributors and if there is a risk of a license change and how the license change would impact your business model. Thanks a lot for listening. And back to Shane.
Thank you indeed, Andreas. Now, you've covered quite a lot of ground on your presentation here, and I think we'll come back to that when it's the panel time. We've had a few questions in, and the questions coming in overlap multiple topics from multiple speakers. So what we'll do is we will continue the presentations, and then in the panel time, we'll have plenty of space for everyone to jump in and answer the questions raised. Now, the next presentation is scheduled to be a specific M&A transaction case study. We'll have Julian standing in for Marcel on this. Julian, are you okay to present at this point?
Yeah, sure.
All right, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Now, while Julian's getting ready to share his screen, just remember there's a Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, and you can always jump in with questions there.
Thank you very much. By the way, I have a co-speaker, Thomas, who should be here any second now, but I will start anyhow. Yeah, first, thank you very much for inviting me to the M&A Summit. I'm standing in for Marcel, who couldn't be available at this time. And we'll talk about open source in deals in a broader context. Yeah, first off, we have two speakers. This is first myself, Julian, and Thomas, who is who's just joined.
He's just joining now.
Perfect. Could you promote him to the panel? There
Yep.
he is.
There we go. Thomas, you're able to share and talk freely.
Hi, Thomas. So first, it's me, Julian. I'm a manager for open source software management at Pwc Germany. And today I brought Thomas with me, who happens to be a lawyer. Thomas, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Hello, all together. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Thomas Urband. I'm a lawyer in the IP, IT, and commercial area, and I've worked on intellectual property related transactions for over 10 years, and have conducted several due diligences and transaction process for technology and software driven companies.
Thank you. We want to talk about open source and business diligence and deals in general. We have a quick agenda, but let's get right into this. First off, I have a quick introduction on Pwc and Deals. You probably know it or not know the company, but I have to tell you that we are not one single big company. Pwc, in fact, is a big network, and this has an impact on our deal strategy. Pwc, by the way, is available in 156 countries. Sadly, it was 157 a while ago, and I'm pretty sure most of you know what changed. Being a large network of independent companies, we have not one single governing way on how to do deals. We have a large partnership and various different topics and customers. In that regard, we do not focus on just one industry or market. You can imagine for pharma and life science, there may be less open source involved than it may be, for instance, in automotive. On the same area, we work with private equity, which tend to be more interested in investing in a given company than, for instance, where startups more likely are ingested in a larger system. So the idea on what a deal is varies from case to case. And this forces us to have a more modular approach on where open source comes in. I think Leon made a great talk on how the organization of open source, of the open source deal, is important and how it can streamline. But we have experienced a more diverse clientele, where we need to make sure open source, where applicable, is understood as quickly as possible. But there's always the side of IP. And for this, I would like to give over to Thomas, and the introduction on how our core work streams and the modular approach works.
Yes, thank you, Julian. When it comes to a concrete project, you usually have like the different core work streams in a transactional project, which is like from the commercial, financial, and due diligence perspective. And then to put it in a context, we have the legal and the technical due diligence, and open source and intellectual property is always part of both. It's part of the legal and the technical due diligence. And Julian today is the responsible person showing you some insights on the technical parts, the open source workstream, which is part of the technical due diligence. And I myself want to give you some insights of the legal due diligence, and in particular, the software IT and open source perspective. As transactions vary from target to target, there's, of course, in addition to those core work streams, a very modular approach. So when we get to the next slides, we see that we have several work streams at PwC covering all thinkable and imaginable aspects of the transactions, but those come into play certainly depending on which kind of transaction is at stake. So in our case, when we look at the legal IP side, I want to give you some insights on this. So what is legal IP in open source deals? You have usually several aspects. I'm not talking about like the trademark, etc. aspects, which are always separate, but I focus on the software aspects. And you always have to see open source in a broader context of the software used and owned by the company, and usually differentiate between off-the-shelf software and, which is like the key part of the company, the proprietary software, which is the asset of the company. When it comes to open source, to off-the-shelf software, it's different on the kind of deal, on the size, on the scoping, whether you review all of the license agreements which are in place, or maybe you just set some like certain thresholds and only look at the mayor license agreement, because many of the open off-the-shelf software agreements are standard and given by the provider. So where the music plays is the own proprietary software by the company. And certainly for the buyer, the purchaser, the most important question is, who owns this proprietary software? And hopefully it is the company, the target, but this is like what the due diligence process is for, to find out. A very important first step is to define what is the relevant proprietary software of the company. And at this stage, in particular, the technical workstream and Julian and my colleagues can help to find out and identify the most relevant software of the company. And then what you do in the first step is to check who has developed the software. And usually there are different stakeholders, which might be like various developers, which is like, for example, freelancers, or it's developed by employees, or other contract developing companies, or it's a mix of proprietary software and certain procured components developed by others. So depending on who is involved in the development process, you have to do different legal assessments on the rights situation. But this is like a very, very important step to find out who is the owner of the IP. And certainly in almost all of the cases, open source software and open source elements are used in within the proprietary software. So what you do usually in a project is you request from the target a list with all the open source components and ideally all the applicable licenses. Depending on the transaction, and not in every case, such list is fully comprehensive, or yeah, it sometimes does not. Sometimes you can say sometimes they have done their homework and sometimes they didn't. So what at this stage we can also do to support is to conduct a check in connection with our technical colleagues to find out which open source software is factually used, like for example, black duck analysis of the software. And then you use the results you got, either you received it in a list or your own check, depending on the depth you want to reach, and you try to identify the applicable licenses. So I want to show you this, and this is on the next slide, in a process chart. So at first you have the legal assessment. As I already said, the most relevant part is to check for the ownership of rights on the core intellectual property side. And then in particular, when it comes to licensing and also the open software components which are used, you check whether there are any restrictions which could restrict the future use of this software by the target. So what you do is you check the licenses and you try to find out whether there's, for example, a so-called copyleft effect, which could lead to an obligation to disclose the full source code of the proprietary software as such, or parts thereof, or if there are, for example, other restrictions on commercial use, for example, licenses which prohibit a commercial marketing and use of the software, which would certainly be a detriment when the software shall be placed on the market and is not like an internally used software. And depending on what you found out in the first assessment phase, you have different options for mitigation. And like from a legal perspective, the main adjustment is, of course, on the contractual side, like on the share purchasing agreement or like the other transaction agreements you conclude. If, for example, you found out in the assessment that certain parts are not fully disclosed or that there might be other issues, then you can, for example, work with guarantees. If you found red flags, for example, contracts where the rights are not fully granted, but these rights are necessary to use the software, then you can work with closing conditions, saying that the target needs to fix this before the deal becomes effective. Or if it's just like minor issues, you can also work with covenants, which means just obliging the target in order to fulfill this or that, to conclude additional licensing agreement, for example, in the future. Certainly, at some point or at some time, it might not be possible, or it might not be sufficient to just do contractual adjustments, and you might also require the target to adjust some things like in the software design or development in order to be compliant and to reduce the risks. And this is certainly also one point which my colleague Julian can support, and he will also continue and tell you more about the technical part of open source in the deals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, my colleague made a great point about the legal side, and but you can't talk about open source and deals without focusing on the legal IP side of things, because after all, open source is but a license. What would you call it? Definition, manifesto? Anyway, when we look at open source and our open source software due diligence, it is possible that we started open source software due diligences or focus on open source, but this is not always the case. More often than not, an acquisition has software as part of it, but this wasn't the most important thing to begin with. As you can see here, if we come to the right side, for instance, we focus on the legal and IP side of things, where Thomas already mentions that it's not just about the open source, it's even about who owns the software itself, who owns the well, trademarks, obviously, and so on. There are a lot of things to consider even before focusing on open source. And at some point, we have to dive into the product OSS compliance side of things. This is what we most notably know as the open source due diligence process, where we look at all the components and so on. But there are way more aspects of open source that are increasingly becoming important or relevant. I think Jan made a great point about cybersecurity in open source. When we want to talk about the acquisition of a given software asset, infrastructure, or you name it, OSS, and especially OSS security, is going to play a role. The question is whether or not this is open source is so important that you focus on open source, or if other aspects of IT security are more important. For instance, there are way more aspects in the ISO 27000 series than just open source. But open source is certainly part of it. And with growing demand, actually, we look at areas like commercial and the value propositions, where we look at a given company. And I think Andreas made a great reference to single product open source companies like MongoDB and the like, where the license of the solution is so important for the survival and strategic positioning of a given asset that we have to consider the open source, not just the licensing, even for sometimes the community, as part of a product's worth. And this is, in certain ways, this is what it's about in a deal. It's not just about the open source and the components. This is a very relevant part. And once we get some red flags that point towards the software and the open source IP, we have to look, of course, at the product OSS compliance, but with growing relevance, the business models rely on open source for smaller and for larger companies. And we have to understand that we need to take this into consideration. Now, the first point I want to stress is the idea of product and organizational OSS compliance. Organizational OSS compliance is basically OpenChain, right? You have a management system and the organization is in itself compliant. This is something we try to put into our practice more, or try to find more commonly in our practice as more companies adapt to OpenChain, because this is the one standard that has everything in it that is relevant for a good open source management. I think Leon made a great point about all the different aspects of OpenChain which are relevant to the short-term diligence process. And if you look at it from a different view, if you have an organization where not just one product or one solution is relevant, and we've talked about this in terms of the software as a service solutions, where it becomes more important that you have a whole organization that understands open source, that has their diligence in place, than having one product that you drill down to the last bit and to the last author. And at this point, OpenChain slowly becomes a relevant aspect to refer to. It's not just another checkbox to fulfill. It enables a compliance infrastructure that you can reuse. It may be even sufficient compliance infrastructure in terms of legal decisions and scanning. When we talk for smaller or less critical components, it may still be too vague for the highest critical aspects. And we've had the chat question about hundreds of millions of dollars. At some point, maybe this is not sufficient. But it's a great way to reduce the risk on a larger level. When we talk about the strategy of open source, and this is what I mentioned with this single product companies, I think we all have the case of MySQL still in our heads and the subsequent fork that happened. With proprietary products, you have different freedoms. You can buy them, you can change them, you can change the pricing model, and everyone you just have to care about is the customer. For open source solutions, this tends to be different. If a deal is to be made, and the business strategy is to incorporate the source code into a larger product, or it is to steer a product away from an existing product, or this or that, the community, as we've seen in other examples, may not like it. And even if you change the license, as we've seen in Andreas' talk, even to a small degree, the community will notice. So this is something where open source becomes more and more relevant, not just from the technical legal aspect of components inside, but even more so on the aspect of having a community, being something that is supported by a wide array of people that you are trying to maybe influence, or depending on what the business goals are. And this has to be reflected beforehand to actually make the right valuation of a company, of a product, in terms of long-term strategies. Now, looking at the time, we have one more thing we want to look at, and this is the whole idea of the red flags that we have to come up with in order to find various aspects of open source where applicable in our daily business. The first thing that we have to talk about is what kind of deal, for instance, are we talking about? Asset deals tend to be quite open source heavy. After all, you're buying something, and even if this is software as a service, this may be still distribution to someone because you're still buying the thing. Kind of depends, but this was an example we had a few months ago. So this was the first red flag: buying a solution, and obviously with part of the asset deal, there would have been a distribution to the next customer. The problem got further, understanding that not just the asset is to be bought, but it is based on a lot of open source software, which we quickly understood, and understood that, of course, this is the relevant part of the software that we have to buy. I think most of you know there will be mentions of compliant use of open source from the get-go, and that all information is available. This, of course, is quite often not the case. Quite often, SBOMs are made on short notice, contain a small number of outdated components, and when there is no formal policy, as OpenChain would, for instance, require, it is likely that these kinds of SBOMs were not looked at beforehand. It is very unlikely that without any kind of governance, there is nothing to be found. So, and then we enter the very common area of the due diligence, where we perform the scans and the reevaluation of the current IPs, copyrights, and licenses, and detect for a given product, if relevant, and if there are risks outstanding, whether or not this is a problem or not. Now, the problem is, if we do so, we have accumulated a lot of red flags on the road, and we have consumed quite some time. I think Leon made it clear at the start that open source scans take some time. This is right. Of course, we have the tools available directly, but they still have to be done. They have to be interpreted. I think we had the license matrix that shows how complicated things can become if you have to reevaluate hundreds of components at a given time. So preferably this has to be done beforehand, and this is where OpenChain actually can help a lot. And this kind of transparency, of course, enables the right decisions. We've talked about this, where maybe can be a deal breaker, unlikely but still possible, where some assets can be removed, prices can be reduced, or assurances and penalties can be negotiated. These are things that shouldn't happen, and I believe everyone is on the same page here. Open source components are literally everywhere, and once we start scanning and it hasn't been managed beforehand, there will be some red flags, and it's going to cause a lot of concern. Hence, the most important aspect for open source diligence processes is having it done having it done beforehand, and so we don't run into too many red flags that actually cause problems down the road. I think I made a good point about OpenChain being a good standard for the open source procurement, open source deal procurement, but just in general, we've seen this is not just the M&A transaction. It becomes more and more apparent that, of course, software is used in normal supply chains, and not just for a larger deal. Even just for reusing software, you have to be sure that the software is right. And we've seen various vendors who actually reassess, similar to a M&A transaction, the capabilities and the licenses of their suppliers to make sure the software is compliant. And in this regard, we still see a lot of need for OpenChain, and it is actually quite irrelevant if it is a deal or a normal supply chain. It is about trust and risks in open source, and if we find a way to reduce those, this is unanimously helpful. I would like to point to 3 key takeaways. Number 1, I think we've talked about this before. Open source is an integral part of almost all businesses with growing importance. And the second one, open source software is even more critical to businesses these days. I recently made a joke about, I think, a woodworking company, well, a wooden check for open source in a woodworking company, just to be corrected, that someone said, well, we had a woodworking company and they actually have a very, very great app, and basically it was the thing that wanted to be bought. It is, open source makes its way into way more aspects than just pure high-level tech acquisitions. It is part of way more companies these days, and it has way more impact on the business side of things. And we've seen the impact that it can have if you buy a company and try to change the business model, especially if it is open source based. It has to be understood beforehand. And the last thing is we have to work on reusable trust, and I believe OpenChain is the approach to go there. If we want to buy products or companies or shares or investments, if we find a way to build trust and reuse this trust by good open source software management, we can create an easier way for all of us in terms of open source. And that will be it. And I thank you all for your time. And of course, we'll stay available for the panel.
And thank you very much, Julian and Thomas. And I will ask everyone else to unmute yourselves, and let's get ready for our little panel. Our purpose of our panel today will be to deal with some of the questions we've had. And with that in mind, I'd like to throw open the first question to the floor, and please feel free to answer it in whatever order you want. The first question comes from Yari, which is, can a licensing change impact deployments from before the license was changed? In other words, if someone changes the license Are your previous deployments okay? Is there something you need to consider? And how does that tie into your M&A optic?
I can take that one. While I'm not a lawyer, I think still if you use an older version, then the license which was assigned to that older version applies. You would just not get maintenance or security vulnerability fixes and all of that. So there is always a push for everybody to go to the newest version, and then you need to adapt to the new license. But we know from several customers who explicitly stay with older versions because there is a more permissive license.
I completely agree, even though I'm a lawyer. But honestly, in fact, I have the same opinion. Usually, once licensed out, you cannot change what you've licensed out. What can happen in practice is that maybe specific software is not available on the internet anymore. However, if your license, in most cases open source licenses do so, give you the right to further redistribute the software, then a subsequent license change would not make a difference. So that's not a big deal, but you have in fact to take care with regard to updates. But what you can do is actually, and I mean, this happened also in the past in many cases, you can fork the project, and you can say we start with the older project and fork it from there, develop it further, patch it, but then you have to stay, of course, to the previous license.
Right, and the only thing I would add is usually not an issue in open source licenses, but if your original license gave the licensor a way to update the license terms, then obviously you can't stay on the original, right? But that's typically not an issue with open source licenses.
Brilliant. And let's dive straight into the next question. Okay. So this is from Gustavo, and it's a little bit of a long question. He's asking, in the event that an acquiring company finds during its open source due diligence that the selling company had declared some things about open source packages and licensing, but the handling of the compliance is different from the acquirer. Okay, so the selling company has a way of doing compliance, but it's different from the acquirer. How do you check if that's okay? For example, if the selling company is doing what they need to do in their jurisdiction and the acquiring company has a different optic, how do you decide if that's okay or not? How do you align those things? What's the type of judgment call you can make?
I would rather look at the different interpretations than at the different jurisdictions. We at least tend to interpret the licenses by the language and, of course, as interpreted or understood by the licensors and maybe even the license stewards. So it's less a national question of local laws. But we have it quite frequently that, for instance, specific licensors or specific parties to an open source dispute, or also to a production chain, have different understandings and interpretations with regard to the licenses, mainly applying occurring in case of GPL, LGPL licenses, where sometimes Drm provisions are interpreted differently. That's hard to resolve, I would say. In some cases, it's just a risk assessment that's behind it. So depending on whether you want to be on the safer side or whether you are willing to take some risk, you may feel comfortable. And then you have to persuade the other party, and the other party if possible. If not, well, I wouldn't recommend litigation, but at least to discuss it until you find a solution.
Yeah, and just to add, if you're like in the transactional context, as a purchaser, you certainly want to be on the safe side. So you try to focus that your interpretation and your safeguarding measures are adhered to in order to proceed with the deal. So, but it always depends on how important is just this current part for the whole overall transactions, and which consequences you might be going to take.
Yeah, and I think just to add to Hendrik's point, I think we're a little bit lucky in the open source world that there doesn't appear, at least in, to my knowledge, and I will be happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. But to my knowledge, there doesn't appear to be a different interpretation of sort of the core aspects of a license. So for example, it's not that in Europe, they think that you can distribute linked GPL code, but in the US, we think that you cannot, right? So in that way, there isn't so much need for, okay, well, what does this jurisdiction say about this particular provision? But obviously, if the need arises, right, there's always local counsel that comes in and says, yeah, okay, so here, this is how we interpret copyright ownership, for example, in Germany versus how we interpret it in the US.
Wouldn't it also be, I mean, in case you really would have such a kind of a discussion, I mean, the contract that you are doing will have some law or will follow some certain law, then probably the interpretation could be used in front of this law, if that really would be an issue.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think Gustavo's question was more in terms of how do you carry on, right? So how do you, first of all, assess the risk in terms of non-compliance or compliance, right? If there are different entities on different parts of the world, but also how do you carry on with the business, right? After acquisition, and yeah, and I think you're right. For the purposes of the deal, it's in some ways you sort of can get there for the future, for continuing to run the business, right? If to the degree that there are differences, then I think, yeah, you need to account for those.
Sometimes I've noticed that there may be nuances that are different with regard to interpretation. So for instance, here in Germany and also in Europe, we have a strong focus on the interpretation by the licensor, which may not be the license steward in terms of having drafted a license. But there's much more autonomy given to the parties with regard to how do you interpret a license, which may lead to the result that if two parties of an agreement are of the opinion that, for instance, copyleft does not apply, in that specific case, copyleft may not apply, whereas in another identical case where the parties have a different understanding of the license, copyleft may apply, even though the license text is the same, simply due to the fact that the license text allows and gives certain room for interpretation. And right. In that case, yeah, one may come to a different solution, Leon, but maybe you have the same or a similar view on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, I think. And what you were saying before, when it comes to interpreting what the licensor means, right? So things that licensors often put in their blogs or in GitHub in terms of, I've seen, I'm sure we all have seen, very sort of copyleft licensed components where the licensor then comes out and says, by the way, I don't care what you link with, I don't care what you do. If you make any modifications, I want to see those, but anything else and everything else you can do. And in a way, right, it's not part of the license itself. So it's not as easy for us to interpret as a license that isn't potentially viral as to linking, but at the same time, it goes a long way, right? Because like you said, it's sort of, even if it's not a legal requirement, right? Even if it's not enforceable later in court, at the very least, it suggests that this licensor is not likely to come after you for this particular issue, right? They think that it's a non-issue. They're not worried about it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that the context of each component in each license is incredibly important.
So let's pivot now to the next question. We had one come in a while back, and it came from an anonymous attendee saying, I can understand that high-level scanning can be a good fit for low-cap transactions since the tech budget will be small. But what about transactions above, say, 100 million? What's the cutoff point where people want a high-level scan versus people want to dig deep? And is it tied to the amount of money the corporation's worth or the corporation makes, or is it very much tied to the structure of the deal in place rather than company size?
To give a short answer on that, I mean, whatever you do in the due diligence should be driven by the risk that you assume. And if there is an area, whether it's in a 10 million deal or in a 100 million deal, that might ruin your case, it's worth to investigate from my point of view. And there, the depths that you take must be deep enough to ensure that this risk is not a risk or can be mitigated somehow. And so therefore, I would not be able to say any kind of order. I mean, for sure, when you have a 10 million deal and you need 20 million to investigate, probably you are at a certain edge where it's not worth, but still it depends on your business model that you're having behind. If you get billions from that, probably still worth. Yeah, but it's
a tough question. I guess the reason people have asked it now, I think in a couple of different ways, is because making that judgment call seems to be a sticking block for people. Case by case, eh?
Yeah, I think, in fact, that's really difficult to say, but I completely agree, Jan, with you. The matter or the main question should always be what's the risk behind it, and of course, what's the efforts. So even if it's the one and only risk, if it's a startup and there's not much funding, there's no possibility to go into depth with regard to a scan. Maybe 10 years later and a few billion euros of turnover later, it's a different story. And then you will take a much more detailed look into the whole matter. But even if it's a large transaction, you just may say, okay, it's not essential. It's just a side aspect, and software is just one of several assets. We can always fix that later. Or you can say, well, software can be replaced, can be redeveloped, is something which is replaceable to some extent, and then it's also a different risk approach. Plus, what we see, it depends on what's the risk exposure of the specific software component. If it's a tool which is used internally only, then it's a different story compared to a software which is provided to end consumers with billions of copies.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, perhaps as the person that led us off with, hey, put the code scan requirement in your letter of intent. Maybe I should weigh in a little bit. Plus, I like hearing myself talk. Yeah, I think one of the reasons we push for code scans in pretty much all cases, I can think of only one deal that I was on in probably the last 5 years where there wasn't a code scan done, and it was a very small deal, and we were on the buy side of it, and I think the sellers were more surprised even than I was that there wasn't going to be a code scan in that situation. And one of the reasons why is so code scans, it can take time, and they obviously do cost money, and on smaller deals that can be a huge deal, but it's not a ton of money, it's not a ton of time, and the time that you've got the developer's full attention is a deal time. So you're actually very likely to get through the questions and get the answers that you need, and then you can get all the remediation that you need out of the way. Once you've acquired the company, you're in the midst of integration, nobody has time for compliance at that point in time, is what we find. So when you've got people's attention, when they're doing diligence anyway, that might be a good time to get all of this done.
I even would add one more thing. I think the bigger the deal, the less important the scanning and details, because the meaning of the software itself, so whatever needs to be done to be fixed, is getting irrelevant compared to the business opportunity that is behind the deal. That's, I think, something, at least something that we sometimes see. People do not want to hear about issues. they just buy them away as side costs. The more interesting aspect that I recognized is what kind of risk am I buying with the stuff that's in field? Because if there is something wrong, and I buy, for example, operational risk that I have to cover later on as the owner of it, that's much more risky than probably sort of a compliance thing.
And I think that's a really valid point to say that in this world, in this real world, things are never going to be as simple and as beautiful as they would be on a piece of paper. There's a lot of demands in play. Now, Chris Wood has a question. Chris, I'm just going to click allow to talk, so you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally.
Yes, I guess it's not really a question. It's more from a technical perspective. I've heard all the lawyers in the room argue with me that you can't really look at the size of the deal to determine how much risk you're willing to accept. Because if you don't do a code scan, you don't have an in-depth code scan, you don't know what the real risk is. And you can get hit with something from a malware perspective that might be leading you right into a massive problem once you acquire the company. And then you got to deal with your reputational risk as well as actual how much cost do you lose. How much dollars it costs.
It's a huge challenge, isn't it, to make that judgment call. And it's hard to know which numbers would balance out. It's like, is it going to cost us pretty much our value from the deal to check this out? Do we walk away from the deal? Do we roll the dice? And it sounds like it's one of those business strategy decisions that could play out in a risky way as well as play out in a sensible way.
Yeah, and maybe we as the open source experts have, I think we are the ones who would always want to go for more transparency and understanding. And the question is whether or not someone wants to understand that and buys it.
Yeah.
And also, like on a risk-based view, you have more options than just the code scan. This is like the most secure option, but certainly you can also look at the compliance processes internally regarding open source and the processes itself, and then can see if you have a reliable system within the target company. Then you can maybe, like, depending on the size of the risk in a certain transaction, refrain from a code scan. Or on the other hand, if you see that like the system, how they handle open source within their company is there are options to improve, then it might make more sense, even like if the risk is medium, to conduct a code scan. So it's you have to take into account several factors, according to my opinion.
We had some echoing notes on this topic. Yari said that security is very much an issue that can be very expensive. Absolutely. Jeff made a note that in his experience, he's seen that commercial and dual licensed software, so GPL versus commercial, can be deal killers or final price modifiers. Any thoughts on that?
I definitely agree, because that's where we would spend the most efforts with regard to clearing. Having a GPL licensed component is one thing, whether this has been developed by a software developer in his free time just for fun, or whether it's a large company behind it with a commercial business model alternatively, makes a huge difference. And this is why we usually take a very close look at the components that are licensed under such strict licenses. And whenever we find any dual license software, it has to be closely checked. Is copyleft effect being triggered, for instance? Are there any restrictions that cannot be fulfilled or complied with? Because in that case, indeed, it can be a deal breaker, as the risk of any non-compliance is significantly higher to be prosecuted and to be challenged than with said single software component developed by a developer in his free time, in his spare time. So what we would generally recommend is to go for a plausibility check first. Thomas, you just said it. One thing is a detailed check, but first thing should be to take a look at the deliverables you have, maybe a software bill of materials, and simply check, is it plausible that this document is complete and does contain everything it should? If someone tells you that he's got an embedded device and provides a list with 2 components, then you would probably say, well, there's probably some operating system underneath, which is in most cases Linux, which means there should be dozens, if not hundreds of components, can't be complete. And in other cases, you may find it's a special tool where it's perfectly fine just to list 2 or 3 components.
Yes, I fully agree. It's a plausibility check, and we also had the situations where Julian found out that when looking at the list that it cannot be complete when you compare all the components and the use of the software, and like subcomponents are missing, etc. So then you can see that the company itself had not done its diligence, and then certainly it's required that you do your own diligence on this.
Warning alarms.
Yeah.
Trigger. That's also something that we came across, is that people cut off dependencies that are probably not required for their purpose, but then do not follow up the modification issues that or the modification obligations that then are triggered. Because it's not clearly understood that given I have a component that's under a certain license, that it comes with a certain set of obligations, but when I change or modify the component, that these obligations change, or may add additional ones, for example, making the change available to others. This is something that is something that exactly puts it or falls into this part that you should verify the structure of those SBOMs that you get.
Absolutely. By the way, I'd like to expand on the idea that there is an existing diligence in companies that you buy, or existing good compliance. I mean, recently Red Hat was bought, and I believe I'm not sure what kind of scans happened there, but I'm pretty sure nobody went through all their code base and made sure it's open source compliance. At least this would be my suggestion. So and as Jeff's regard towards the especially GPL licenses was as part of deal breakers, I believe it's always just about the obligations we are unwilling to fulfill, because everything else, if we're honest, can be done. I don't believe a deal would ever fail because there is no notice file. I think we can deal with that. And if we forgot to mention upstream things, this can be done. The question is there something going to happen that we cannot fulfill? And I believe this is most notably a GPL problem. Sometimes license incompatibility, but I believe the core of things is always GPL.
Makes sense. And we have Michael just echoing Yari's comment, just noting that if there isn't enough time for a deep or forensic level scan during M&A, considering a post-acquisition technical due diligence and analyze code post-M&A. I'll just give context for that. Yari was just talking about the value of full forensic scanning, because smaller deal software could get integrated into a bigger system and risk can go up. Though he did highlight that he encountered one time where no code audit happened, but that was a deal that happened between Friday and Monday. And after that, the code got audited by business unit, thus leading us to Michael's note that further audits later might be on the table. That's an interesting point. Now, I think here we've covered most of the questions incoming. And what I'd like to do is to tie it up a bit. Some people might be listening to all of this information and be thinking, this is a lot to take on board. and then err towards thinking, well, maybe it's just a risk center, and I don't want to handle this risk. So I'm going to try and avoid open source, which on this call, as we know, avoiding open source is not on the table these days. So how do we approach this without fear? Get it right, but not hesitate to close good deals.
That's a good question. I think it all starts with prep work, right? As everyone's been talking about, right? And I think again, this is where OpenChain plays such a huge role. Like way back when we first heard about what you guys were doing here with OpenChain, before we even really got involved, we looked at it and we said, look, there's a lot of repetition of work on deals, right? So if you're a seller and you've done your diligence and you've done all of your reviews, and then you go through an acquisition, and the buyer then goes out and does the same review of the same components, asks the same questions, right? If only there was a way to share that information, right? And to have the seller show up and say, hey, here's all the work that I've already done, right? All you need to do is just double check, right? Check my policies, make sure they align with yours, check the outcome of the review. And that's what OpenChain gives you, right? It gives you this ability. So I think the bigger OpenChain gets, the more companies become compliant to the specification, and the more companies get certified. I think the easier it's going to get, right, for all of us to get comfortable. And I'm sorry, I'm horrible with names. I can't remember who said it, but somebody made a very good point that this isn't just transactions. It has to do with your regular sort of business interactions, right? Your customers are going to be asking for your bills of material. They're going to be asking for your compliance when it comes to open source. And a lot of that is driven by security, right? And the fears that we all have around that area. A lot of it is also driven by the fact that they have to be in compliance as well. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm doing a very good job answering your question, but I think the point that I want to make is that the more work we do up front, the easier the actual deal work becomes, right? And then it just becomes sort of a non-issue. And as far as getting the work started, right, don't think about tackling all of it. Just sort of pick off a small piece and go with it. What we like to do is say, look, let's pick a small product, right? Let's pick a small code base. Let's review that. From that, let's form a policy that your developers can then participate in and then use, right? And then once that machine is sort of going, then you tackle all of your other code bases, all of your other products, and you sort of slowly bring yourself into full compliance.
I think that's a brilliant answer, Leon. And certainly I can't argue with the idea that OpenChain is central to building confidence. I'll run with that. We have a question which flows neatly from this and might be the question we need to tie a bow on this event. So we know that we can do due diligence. We know there's multiple approaches and there's different tolerances for what you need to do. We know that something like OpenChain can be the key to basically saying, not only is this doable, but it's very clear how you do it in a repeatable manner. So the fear of the unknown is not necessary. And this leads us to a market situation question, which came from Justin. Hey, Justin, it's been a while. And Justin was asking about, when we dig into stuff from market experience, is poor open source compliance considered a hidden debt in merger situations? And in his question, he's asking specifically in Asia, is it something that's been a hidden debt in mergers or acquisitions? And so it's more of a market experience question. If no one has a specific experience that they want to talk about, I'd say this is something that could be generalized. Has poor compliance been a hidden debt noticed much?
I mean, I think most deals will experience some sort of incompliance and relevant incompliance that may be a major problem. I think it's unlikely that there is nothing. So some sort of hidden debt is always there. I believe there's a question of size and relevance, and whether or not this applies specifically to Asia. I believe this is globally existent, and wouldn't tie it to a given region.
And like the standard case with open source is nobody expects that any issue will arise, but at least 50-60% of the transactions, one issue arises and needs to be solved. So it's a topic which is often underestimated and in many cases comes up.
I would even say it's depending on the sophistication level, and here I think OpenChain is doing a great deal because it's slowly increasing the sophistication of everybody in the market. But when you run into unsophisticated targets, you can find everything. We had even a situation where someone is saying, we are not using open source. And I said, oh, then we can do a scan. We found that 95% is open source. So you can find everything there, but it's all about sophistication.
Yeah, that's followed up neatly by Justin's second comment, where he's saying that his past experience is poor compliance is ignored in certain areas like Taiwan, and he's seen it lead to a large price cost post-merger in tidying up the mess. And I think Phil in the chat also said poor compliance processes lead to license issues in the code. That's the hidden debt. You have to dig through that, and it's a bit of an expensive pain, suggesting that the solution is have good processes in place or instituted as soon as possible. Chris asks a good question. He's asking, wouldn't poor open source compliance possibly drive not just license debt, but technical debt? Because people aren't quite sure what the technology is they're using. Their maintenance of the technology wouldn't be good, and that would feed into the problem. Any thoughts on that? Because we've been sticking pretty closely to the legal side and legal debt, legal risk. It's intriguing that not keeping track of the software can naturally lead to the technical debt issue as well.
I would like to say it does, but actually I've seen pretty good management of components. I mean, there was a trend recently, especially in the web world, where developers tend to become a lot better at least managing their CVEs and their supply chains, where the software comes from, while still not looking at it. So I would at least try to make the point, it's still possible to have a secure software without having good license compliance, but I still absolutely would like to say it is integral to the software, especially for complex software, that you know what's inside.
Brilliant. And as our time is heading towards a natural end, I'd just like to ask if you have a final thing you'd like to say to our existing audience, but also the people who'll be looking at this as a recording in the months and years to come. A final thought to share.
Maybe if I can start, just one short comment. Don't be afraid of compliance. Don't be afraid of the whole process. It may look like a huge mountain, but if you go step by step, then you should be able to make it. And don't go for the 100 or even 120% in the beginning. Just take it really in smaller chunks and smaller steps, and try over the time.
I just can agree to that. Not doing it, from my point of view, is a big failure. But doing it and advancing helps a lot. It helps create transparency about what you are actually doing and what you are having inside your solution. And It also increases the awareness of what kind of work is actually consumed, and therefore also increases the transparency of what needs to be done in case you have issues in your own software. So from my point of view, if you are concerned about delivering a good service, this is part of the hygiene that you need to be doing. Yeah. So otherwise it will be very difficult to get a real transparency about the software and the solution that you are operating.
Yeah,
I would
just
like
to echo. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I would like to add that it makes real sense to approach things proactively. And yeah, if you think about open source in your M&A projects and in your company, either as a buyer or as a seller, you are already on the winning side, and you will find solutions, and depending on the project, efficient ways to handle with it. Just deal with it proactively.
Yeah, just to echo what everybody else is saying, right? I think the worst thing that you can do after sitting here through 3 hours of us talking about open source is walk away and say, well, this is too big, I'm not going to do anything, right? That's the absolute worst thing that you can do. A little bit of compliance goes a long way, and you'll find that it snowballs, right? You start small, and then all of a sudden everything sort of falls into place and it becomes not all that difficult. It's not hard to get started. It's not expensive to get started. I'm sure everybody on the panel will back me up on that, right? And there are lots of people that have done this before and that can help. So that's definitely it. And one other thing that I just wanted to say, and I'm sure everybody else will echo this too, is thanks to Shane and to OpenChain for giving us the forum. Anytime that we can spend a few hours talking about open source compliance is really awesome. So thanks for the opportunity.
I will also have a final thought that nowadays there's no way around open source. If you build software today, you have to use open source, otherwise it's not really efficient. And we have seen many companies in the past years who created their own processes or tried to be compliant and tried to manage it somehow. And I think now with the standards that are available, it's much better for everybody. Everybody has just a blueprint and can follow that. And there's quite a high level of reliability on the compliance that you get afterwards. And also, thank you, Shane, for this forum. Thank you for setting all of this up.
What can I say? You know, we've been talking about M&A in the OpenChain community, and it's been evident it's been more and more important. I mean, the first time people talked about OpenChain and M&A was about 2018, and it was early days. But in the last few years, it's come up again and again. So having this summit and having you as people who provide support to companies doing this, share your thoughts is invaluable. And I really want to say thank you, everyone, for making so much time to go into this in detail from multiple angles. I think it's the first time we've actually had this type of discussion about open source and M&A led by a project like this. So deeply appreciated. And, you know, big thank you to Leon, who pulled the event together, and absolutely everyone who jumped in as a speaker and put a lot of time into preparation. And thank you to the audience. And bear in mind, of course, that this will be recorded. It will be shared, and it will be available for your friends, your competitors, and your clients to look at in the future as a resource. So with that, we shall wrap up. Take care, everyone. Be healthy, be safe, and see you at the next summit.